I'm Mr. MegaManFan, and this is Homebrew Review. Now, the idea of multi-carts has been around for a long time. In the 1980s, we had the famous double-ended cartridges from Zonox with two games on each end. Not two games in one cart, but one cart with two games. And of course, there's the infamous Action 52 for NES, which claimed to have 52 unique games on it, but not all of them were even in a playable state, and it was sold for $200, although that's cheap compared to what it goes for nowadays. Then, of course, you have Famicom cartridges, which say they have 666,666 games in one, which sort of set a precedent for all future Famicom carts to have a ridiculous number of games, but most of those games were just repeats and renumbered. Like, you'd get Mario Brothers as game number 1, game number 570, game number 1324, and so on and so forth. And then you get the weird Game Boy Advance multi-carts, which usually had Famicom games and pirated Game Boy Advance games. Let's just say multi-carts have been around for quite a long time and have taken on quite a few different guises. But even in 2005, the idea of a multi-game cart for Atari 2600 wasn't as established as you would think, because the number of games that you could fit into a ROM of applicable size was going to be difficult. I mean, this is a system that was notoriously limited to 4K, so even to go beyond that, you'd have to do bank switching. So you'd have to have 4 1K games if you wanted to have a multi-cart, and how much could you pack into 4K, let alone into only 1K? So you might imagine that no way in heck could anything resembling a multi-cart exist unless it was the equivalent of an EverDrive, like Kurt Schell's Cuddle Cart 2 for Atari 7800, where you can load as many ROMs onto a memory card as you like, 2600 and 7800. But that's not what this is. What Atari released in 2005 was a genuine multi-game, single cartridge, physical release for Atari 2600, the 2005 minigame compilation. And as the name implies, these are not large games, but it's still impressive that they fit this many games onto one cartridge, and that they're all playable games, and some are even quite good, and included full instructions on the cartridge for each individual game. You can actually click on instructions from the home menu and scroll through, and that's pretty amazing in and of itself, because you never saw instructions within Atari games. They were always in the manual separately, but they pulled it off here, and the text is actually quite large and readable, which, considering the blocky pixelated graphics of the 2600, is also an impressive feat in itself. Out of all of these mini games, my favorite has to be Jetman, which is quite obviously an homage to Jetpack from the ZX Spectrum. And this is one of those rare cases where you have to admit that the ZX Spectrum has the superior version of something, because in Jetman, you don't have enemies to contend with, you just have missiles flying across the screen. So all you can do is avoid those missiles, pick up the fuel, power up your rocket to lift off, and then try to collect more fuel to do it all over again with an increasing number of missiles flying your way. Now, I have to accept this compromise because it's hard to imagine that they could have had that many enemies on the screen in a mini-game cartridge compilation, and the physics of firing at those enemies with your Jetman might have been nearly impossible to program in such a small size. But it works for these limitations, and it's quite fun because it does get more challenging when there are more missiles on the screen. The more levels you complete, the harder it gets to play. Prior to that, you saw Hunchy, which is a very simple game that's fun for short periods of time. It riffs on Pitfall a little bit in that you get single screens you have to clear with obstacles in your way, swinging vines, and enemies to jump over, and occasionally it throws in something like a missile that you have to avoid at the same time you're jumping or swinging. So it does increase in difficulty from one screen to the next. But you're not collecting any gold, you're not going for a high score, you're just trying to survive for as long as you can and make as much progress as you can. And eventually, what will kill you is your own frustration because you can retry a stage over and over, but you might just find it tedious and quit. But that's the advantage of it being a minigame multi-cart is you've got a lot of different choices here. Knight Rider is another choice, and to me this one falls somewhere between Jetman and Hunchy in terms of playability. I might like it a little more than Hunchy, but then again I could flip the other way on any given day. The premise is basically ride for as long as you can and score as many points as you can, with the terrain moving up and down and your motorcycle being able to speed up, slow down, and jump. So obviously at some points you're going to have to jump over chasms, jump from one set of platforms to another, but all the while you've got this helicopter dropping missiles on you, menacing you, so you have to speed up or slow down to avoid the enemy if it's firing these projectiles your way, and you've got to make the jumps and slow down if you can't make the jumps, or speed up if you're not going fast enough to clear them. So it's fun for a little while, but eventually you'll want to switch to something else. What I wouldn't recommend switching to is Marble Jumper, a game I found so unappealing I didn't even include the footage of it in this video. Have you ever been at a restaurant where they have those little board games you can play, and one of them is move a peg over a peg and then remove the peg that you jumped over? That's essentially what Marble Jumper is, with quote-unquote marbles instead of pegs. If you like puzzle games, it's fine, I guess, but for me it was graphically boring, the sound design was nothing to write home about, the overall aesthetic was just bleh. So Marble Jumper didn't even live up to the name, because you would think you're shooting marbles or rolling marbles around a maze, doing something fun with marbles, and it's really not. So let's move on to another minigame from this compilation that is a lot more fun than Marble Jumper and might even be a little more fun than Knight Rider 2. It's called Rocket Command, and the premise is simple enough. Aliens are moving up the playfield from various points on the screen, and you've got a row of rockets on the left side that you can fire at the aliens to defend your world. But of course, you have to time it so that the rockets intersect the aliens. And it gets harder to do the lower the rockets get on the screen, because when they're high on the screen, when you're using the top of the rockets, they can be timed so that you can figure out when the alien is coming and when to intercept it. But when you get down to the rockets at the bottom, you're essentially just crap shooting. It's like fish in a barrel. You have to fire it off and just hope it intersects something, because you haven't even seen it move up the screen yet. You've got time to react at the top, you can hit them. You've got no time to react at the bottom because you're not even seeing them on the screen yet. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do, man. Game over, man. Game over. So those bottom rockets, just fire them wildly and pray for the best. It's good. It's not great. It literally is a minigame. Like, here's something you can play for 5 or 10 minutes to kill some time. It's not going to suck you in or invest you in a expansive world that sucks you into problem solving and leveling up and exploring the map and getting new items and figuring out how to use them and exploring again when you have those new items and they unlock old areas you couldn't reach previously, and doing heroic quests. There's none of that here. It's just rockets on the screen and enemies to fire the rockets at. Boom, done. It's okay. It's what a minigame should be. It's fun for a little while, then you hit reset on the Atari 2600 and pick something else. Or if you're using an emulator, whatever controller you have mapped or whatever keyboard press you have mapped, you hit that and you go back and pick another game. It's fun for a little while and then you move on. I am amused that the aliens in this game do look like they were ripped straight from Space Invaders, and I do like the fact that they speed up the longer you play, making them harder targets to hit. So the designer of this particular minigame did consider keeping some challenge in it the longer you go, making it faster and harder to play. Here's another interesting game from the minigame compilation, This one is called Zirconium, and it features these blocks that fall constantly towards you, or you're traveling up through them, whichever way you choose to look at it. I'll choose to think that I'm traveling through this playfield, and you pick up the P along the way to replenish your power, and once you survive that by shooting your way through it or just maneuvering around it, you get a boss fight, and that cycle will just repeat itself. You'll travel through the playfield, you'll get a boss fight, repeat, rinse, lather, repeat. It's okay. Again, it's a mini game. You don't expect it to be more or less than that. And this one in particular looks like it could have been done on any console or any computer of the day, thanks to the simple block graphics and the simple premise and the simple way that you play it. ZX Spectrum, PC Junior, Commodore 64, TI 99-4A, Trash 80, anything could have run this. I literally think anything could have done Zirconium. But it's still colorful and fun. It's the right mix of challenge and replayability for a minigame on a compilation of this type. By the way, since I mentioned that 4K limitation and how games larger than that had to do bank switching in a lot of cases, this one clocks in at an impressive 32K and features 4 different designers across the 7 games included. I have to imagine the rest of the available space on the cart was reserved for the instructions that are included in the game, the soundtrack for the menu when you're using it, and the menu selection program itself to access all of these different mini games. Credit where it's due to Chris Walton, Fred Quimby, Bob Montgomery, and Zach Matley for programming all of the games included on this cart. The label and manual were designed by Nathan Strum if you buy a physical edition of the game, which is only $25 and is still available through the AtariAge.com store some 16 years after this was first released. The final game I'm going to talk about on this compilation is M4, which you can already see is a tank warfare game, and it's based on an arcade game of the same name. Essentially, you have to destroy either the player 2 controlled by a human opponent or take on the computer AI, and you have to shoot through the barrier to reach the opponent or hit the targets that are flying behind for extra points. And it's a race to get the most points in the time that's allotted to you, which you see counting down at the top of the screen in the middle. Every time one tank or the other gets destroyed, the timer stops and the playfield resets. There's also a limited number of bullets in your tank, so when you deplete those, you have to reload the tank, and you can be shot while you're reloading, or vice versa. It threw me off at first when I saw loading on the screen, because I'm like, this is an Atari 2600. It's not loading anything from disc or CD or DVD. That makes no sense. And then I was like, oh yeah, it's asking me to reload my gun. Still, it was amusing just for a moment to think that somehow, some way, this was actually loading the gameplay because it was too powerful for the primitive Atari 2600, but that is not the case. I'm Mr. MegaManFan. This has been Homebrew Review. As always, thank you for watching. Like, share, comment, and most of all, subscribe.